So I'm curious about Union Station, your new record. It's got this train theme, not just in the title, but like interspersed between the longer tunes. There are these kind of train themed interludes and kind of vignettes, even sometimes with train sounds. What inspired you to be thinking about trains and travel?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, I love trains and I love train stations. I think they're so cool, and it's like it's a bygone era when you step into a train station. And there's Union stations all over the country, but it's kind of like stepping into the past with the amazing architecture and the elegance, and it's just kind of fun to think about all of the people that have passed through and traveling. So that's I've just really had a fondness always for train stations, and especially Union Station in Denver. It's such a beautiful place to go. And I would commute when I commuted into work. I would go there daily and have coffee and just kind of hang out. But I think conceptually, well, there's a couple of things happening. I think with all of my solo recordings, I like to have some sort of a theme that ties it together. And that's just for like the storytelling aspect of it, or something to maybe bond the music together. So prior to Union Station, for example, I recorded an album of the music of Thelonious Monk, and then an album of the music of My Fair Lady. And just, I like having some sort of a, recurring theme, I guess, because I think of music as being a visceral thing to package. I guess I'm old fashioned in the sense that I like delivering an album, which is like a book. And so I like to set it up with, prologue and chapters and development and maybe an epilogue. And I know very few people listen to music that way anymore, but I still like to at least present it that way. That's one
Yeah.
level. The other, I think, metaphor type of thing I was thinking was that Union Station is a metaphor for a place of gathering. And so this was, as I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, this was kind of my COVID project. And when we as musicians and we as human beings and just, people were all of a sudden stripped overnight of the ability to travel, to gather in person, to see each other face to face, to shake hands and hug and play music. That was devastating. At the very least, it still is traumatic for so many people, and so you realize that a lot of these things that we took for granted, for example, just gathering face to face, playing music together, meeting, going to eat a meal together, it's like all of a sudden it just was like this. Wow, this was such a gift that we didn't even realize. So the part of the concept of Union Station was really celebrating the ability to travel, to gather, whether you're seeing friends and family, to tour and have different musical experiences, all of those things. And so I prepared a body of music that was pretty loose. And also, I think kind of the common musical theme was the blues and variations on like a 12-bar blues, and on how you can stretch that out. And just if you were the same as if you were with somebody who was like a baker, and you said, well, bake a pie or bake some muffins, and then all of the different variations that you could do on this staple thing. And then just we had a limited budget. We always do, as I always do anyway. So we did it in 2 days, and we had some time left over on the second day, and I had this idea of just improvising some interludes, meaning like, let's not even talk about it. Let's just dive right in. Somebody start playing something, and let's just see what happens. And those are the interludes that ended up going on there.
Oh, okay. I see. I see. Man, your sound on the record is really rich and detailed throughout the whole record, but especially on "Under the Western Stars," there's something about that tune where the guitar just speaks in a special way, and it also features some of your chord melody playing. I wonder, did you have a different approach in recording that song, or the way you mixed it, or did you, anything like that?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, because you are such a tonesmith, and that like really you pay so much attention in your own playing. So I appreciate that. Tone is something that I think I'm trying to work on more than anything else. And when I say that, it's holistic in the sense of, yeah, gear is a part of it, and miking and everything has to do with that equation. But I think ultimately it starts with the touch, and how
Right.
you approach
Yeah.
the instrument. But yeah, this was new for me because this was my first, even though I've been playing for many years in ensemble situations, this was my first band record. And so the process of mixing and working with an engineer, talking about drum sounds, for example, was entirely new. And it was a huge learning experience. And I don't really play with a pick very much. So that was another thing, trying to get my sound conveyed with this thing stuck in between me and this, in between me and the guitar. And so I'm just so used to playing with my fingers that was kind of a thing that I had to overcome.
Right.
But I did think about it a lot. The engineer that I worked with, John McVeigh, is somebody that I trust a lot. And we tried a bunch of different amps and miking techniques. And we ended up going with two amps, a Henriksen amp that I use all the time, made by my good friend Peter Henriksen, and a 62 brown face Princeton that I've had forever, since the early 90s. And I love Princetons. They're kind of my favorite amp of all time, along with the Henriksens. And so I was going through both of those, and I think we had a total of 5 mics. The Princeton is open back, so we had one behind the amp, one right on it, on the speaker. I have a Jupiter speaker in that amp, which I really love. And then we had a room mic, and then the guitars that I used were pretty much this guitar, which is a new guitar by a wonderful maker in California named Tad Brown, and this is one of his arch tops, but it has this it's like a replication of a Charlie Christian pickup made in England. They're called CC pickups. And I love the sound of these pickups. I really love single coil pickups, but there's something about the full Charlie Christian setup that I've always been really attracted to.
Yeah.
And then the other guitar that I used on that record is a 50s Gretsch that was just sitting around in the studio that belonged to the engineer. And it had this really cool original Dynasonic on it, and it had this lovely, like, clear gasoline oil can kind of spongy sound that I really liked, and it had flat wounds on it. And the engineer was like, "Hey, check this out." And I was like, "Wow, this really sounds cool." So I ended up using it on a bunch of tracks, and so that guitar really responded well with like flat wounds into trying to get a Billy Bean, Hank Garland kind of sound that I was trying to go for, at least, and then balancing that out with this with round wounds.
Yeah, I hadn't seen the Tad Brown guitars before until I saw some video of you on YouTube playing a blue Tad Brown guitar.
Yeah. So I have my other guitar. I actually don't have it in this room right now, but that was my first guitar that I got from Tad, and that is also on Union Station. It's on the last 2 songs, Amarillo and then Palo Duro Canyon, which is kind of just like a little prelude to that. And that one has Fralin P90s in it, and I just love the combination of I love P90s anyway, but I love the combination of his guitar. And I met Tad at a guitar show a few years ago, and I think you've been to some of these guitar shows where it's strictly small shops, independent luthiers and builders, and the weekend is just a celebration of them and their instruments. But throughout that weekend, there's a bunch of workshops and concerts. And I've kind of been on that scene for a little over 10 years now. I love them. I love builders and luthiers and being around them and learning about the guitar. I mean, I realized that I've been playing the guitar so long, but there's so much that I don't know about it in terms of the construction and the wood and bracing, and I have so much respect for how they honor musicians. So anyway, I met Tad at one of these shows, and I was demoing his instruments, and I immediately fell in love with his guitars.
Wow. Yeah. Well, they sound beautiful in your hands. It's interesting when you mentioned about recording with the organ trio, and coming from, like, you've been making solo records since River Coffee is a solo record, right?
Yeah.
And then the Monk record and the My Fair Lady record. So I was going to ask you, how your approach changed when it came to arranging and composition. I mean, I know the Monk record is Monk tunes and Lerner and Lowe wrote My Fair Lady, but you've recorded original songs before. So I was going to ask you about composing and arranging, which I still want to ask you about, but it hadn't occurred to me that the other considerations that you mentioned, like, yeah, just getting a drum sound, or changing guitars, or how to get the sound that you want, which is different from when you're making a solo record.
Yeah.
Well, but I'm curious though. I do want to ask you about writing and arranging. But I'm curious why, or was there something specific about the organ trio? Did it lend itself to the? Did you think organ trio and then write in a vein that suited it, or were you just writing tunes and then said, oh, maybe an organ trio would be good for this music, or?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd like to hear your take on it as well. So a couple of things that I got from what you just said and what you just asked. So just in terms of the sound, something that I think a lot of guitar players don't necessarily think about is the recording sound. And that's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about and at least asking questions. And so to give you an example of that, we all have our favorite guitar players, for example. And we could all point to recordings where they just didn't sound so good, And then there's those recordings where, like, oh my gosh, the sound is so. So, for example, I'm thinking of Wes Montgomery or Kenny Burrell or anybody.
Yeah.
And there are Wes always sounds incredible. Wes always sounds like himself. He always sounds like, to me, the perfect jazz guitarist. But there are some recordings where he doesn't sound so good. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that the amp is breaking up, the tone is kind of thin, it's low in the mix. And so I had this epiphany at one point, realizing my favorite sounding guitar records don't just reflect the compositions and the playing style of the individual. Of course, that's a big part of it, but it also reflects the recording engineer. And
Sure.
so that's a big part of whether we're talking about, Rudy Van Gelder or Steely Dan records, 70s, all of that stuff. It's like, wow, that's something that not a lot of people consider. And there's nothing worse than, for example, being in a studio where you're getting a terrible sound and you feel like you have no control over it.
Right.
So that was really important to me, to have the recording aspect of it be open for communication to really get the sound that I wanted. So to that end, before our 2 days of recording, I booked a couple of hours with the engineer just to go in there and just do guitar stuff and try to get a sound until I was happy with it. Compositionally, I think, to answer your question, both. There are some tunes that I specifically wrote for organ trio, and then there are a couple of tunes that I had kind of kicking around that then I arranged for organ trio. So there's one song on there called Narrow Gauge, and that was a song that I originally composed for a group with 5 horns, and it was like a full ensemble. Other tunes I had arranged for more of like a guitar, bass, and drum ensemble. That I just kind of tweaked a little bit for the organ trio. But I've always loved organ trio. I think every guitar player that likes jazz and plays jazz, the organ trio is a special place in our hearts for that. Because
absolutely.
Oh, it's just most of my favorite guitar players from that particular era, and not just, the obvious ones like Wes and Kenny and Pat Martino, but like, people like Billy Butler and Quentin Morin and, oh man, I just love that. And then there was that 90s kind of, that retro thing that was going on in the 90s with Medeski, Martin, and Wood. And
sure.
I just have always loved that sound. So I think I write a little differently, and I certainly play differently in an organ trio compared to like a bass guitar drums trio.
Coming back to solo guitar, which is again really how I know you, and I think I might have mentioned this to you, but if I didn't, I will. I'm doing this for a Patreon channel that I have that's focused on solo guitar, and a few of the guys there are like, oh, you got to get Sean. And so I thought it was so interesting that when I reached out to you and realized like, oh wow, Sean's new record is organ trio record, but I want to ask him about solo guitar because that's, I think, how a lot of people know you. You've made records that way, you've done True Fire courses that way, you've done books for Acoustic Guitar Magazine for on fingerstyle jazz guitar. So I think a lot of people think Sean McGowan, fingerstyle jazz guitarist, even though you do switch hats. But for players that are maybe coming around to solo guitar, kind of early on that journey, I'm asking this because I know you're also a teacher. Like, what do you recommend as far as technical stuff or just headspace stuff? If somebody comes to you and says, I'm really curious about solo guitar, but I don't know where to start, like, what do you usually tell students at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think with everything else, my first answer is usually listen, just start by listening. And whether I think one of the beautiful things, one of the many beautiful things about solo guitar is that it's wide open in how you approach it. It's not like there's just one way. If you want this, then you must do this, this, and this. You can, I mean, if you want to play solo guitar, there are so many different ways of doing it. I think infinite, really. And ultimately, that will be influenced by your thinking and all of the other things that you listen to. But to give one example, if you want to approach solo guitar with kind of a full orchestral way, meaning multiple parts. And that was something that really attracted me to solo guitar initially, because I had been listening to a lot of fingerstyle acoustic players, but then also a lot of, solo jazz players like Tuck Andrus and Earl Klugh and Lenny Breau, and they had a very full approach to that. That's just one way of playing solo guitar, but that's how I got into it. And when I first started listening to it, it just seemed impossible. Like I was like, well, how are they getting all of those parts happening? I just don't understand. And so for me, it was just listening to those recordings over and over again. And after a while, it kind of becomes a part of your subconscious. So you can hear that it's not only possible, but your ears just start to hear that. Even at the surface level, you're hearing maybe a moving bass line and you're hearing some chords in there. And gradually over time, what seems to be just straight up impossible starts to, it doesn't seem as foreign anymore, or like, it just becomes more relatable. And so that's what I did. Like every night I would kind of go to sleep with like a little Walkman. I had a tape cassette, and I listened to Earl Klugh's solo guitar record over and over again, and Tuck Andrus's Reckless Precision, and then his Christmas holiday record over and over again. And then for me, I got into other classic guitar recordings later. Like later I listened to Virtuoso, and later I listened to Barney Kessel, solo guitar, and everybody has kind of gotten into that. But I was initially attracted by the way that fingerstyle players approached, because they were able to get all of those different parts. So that's how my concept was formed. And I would say, in addition to that, when I was first getting into it, I listened to a lot of piano players' solo recordings. So, for example, Oscar Peterson's recording, My Favorite Instrument. And, everybody kind of associates Oscar Peterson with just being this burning, like the chops and the Art Tatum and the full neck.
Athletic kind of,
Right. Which, of course, he is, and swings and stuff. But he's such an incredible ballad player. And when you listen to him play ballad, especially his solo piano recordings, it's his voicings and his depth and his nuance and dynamics are just beautiful. And so he was a big influence. Marcus Roberts, Bill Evans, Thelonious Monk, all of their solo recordings were just, I just loved. It was like a different way for them to express themselves. And so I don't want to go on forever about this, but for me, there was something, the chamber aspect of playing the guitar, for example, that I was really attracted to. And so what I mean by that, right about the same time in my life, and so you and I are basically the same age, right? So at that time, straight ahead wasn't really popular. I mean, no one was playing like straight ahead bebop in
Right.
the late 80s and early 90s, right?
Well,
And
Winton, and then that was about it.
yeah, right. It wasn't. It wasn't kind of. I mean, I guess it was. Maybe it had its resurgence in the mid '90s, but
Right.
certainly for this time in my life, kind of jazz guitar was Pat Metheny, Mike Stern, John
Right,
Scofield,
sure,
like more
sure.
fusion.
Of course.
Which I love that, and I liked playing that. But what I felt is that with all that sound and volume and everything, it kind of narrowed me artistically. Like you play with a pick, and you got to play lines, and they're always got to be at this level, and then you comp, and that's kind of, I just felt that to be limiting after a while.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
So playing guitar with my fingers and then the solo context gave me the opportunity to explore the guitar in a lot of different ways that I felt weren't possible when you're playing in, for example, a quartet or a quintet with a sax player and a loud rhythm section.
Right. Right. Yeah, the kind of, when you have multiple parts and contrary lines and stuff on the guitar, a lot of that stuff would get lost, I think, in a group. Like I'm thinking of like Scofield with his quartet records with Joe Lovano, or what's that great record that he made with Joe Henderson, So Near, So Far?
Yeah, the musings for Miles of the Miles record. Oh,
Yeah.
so incredible.
Right. And of course it's still so nuanced what he's doing. But yeah, the level of stuff you're talking about with fingerstyle guitar doesn't necessarily translate into that kind of setting. I am curious though, because I started when I knew we were going to talk, I started listening to River Coffee, which is a record that I had not heard before. When I met you, I think it was more around the My Fair Lady record, and I heard some stuff on there that sounded more like fingerstyle acoustic guitar, not necessarily jazz players. So I'm curious, like you mentioned, the jazz guys like Earl Klug and Tuck Andrus, and then on the piano side as well. But I'm curious if there are some acoustic guitar players that you were into, especially at that point early on, that you'd want to mention, because I think I bet you some of the names would surprise me and even some of the guys on Patreon.
Yeah, sure. So when I was young, I had the good fortune of seeing actually a lot of people, which is surprising when I look back at it because I'm from Maine. But a lot of people, believe it or not, kind of came through there occasionally. And one of them was Chet Atkins. And I saw him, and it was just kind of mind-blowing in the sense that there was so much music coming out of just one guitarist. And that made a big impression on me when I was young. And right around the same time, I had a teacher, like in 8th grade, I think it was, that made me a cassette of Segovia and on John Williams. And it was just kind of mind-blowing in that, like, wow, this is such a complete musical picture. And how are they doing that? And I never studied classical guitar, but I have always had this, peripheral appreciation of and love for classical guitarists and Brazilian guitarists later on, and African fingerstyle guitarists. And so over the years, I was really into the Windham Hill players such as Michael Hedges and Alex DeGrassi, Leo Kottke, that 6 and 12 string guitar album.
So good.
So it's just, I just loved it. And I love acoustic music too. And I love the acoustic guitar as an instrument. And so I've always really listened to a lot of different styles of music. I love folk music. I love Irish music. I love, just all kinds of styles. And so that the way that those types of folks, like Paul Simon, for example, the way that he would just play with his fingers was just really appealing to me. And the sensibilities, I think, technically and harmonically of somebody like Alex DeGrassi was really appealing to me because they were using all of these sophisticated techniques and harmony. And I think what sets those players, in my mind, apart from the slapper tappers, I think a lot of people call them, the current, fingerstyle, was their compositional sensibilities. Michael Hedges as a composer, Alex DeGrassi as a composer, they were playing the same harmonic sensibilities that I loved about jazz. But they weren't playing changes. They were just doing something different with it.
Hmm.
And then later on, Cacho Terral and Luis Bonfa, all those Brazilian guitarists,
Yeah, I know Luis Bonfa's name, but who was the first one you said?
there's an Argentinian guitarist, Cacho Terral, and yeah, he was. I think he was kind of under the radar. His recordings are hard to find, but again, somebody made me like a mixtape, literally, of his playing. It was just beautiful. Very similar to a lot of these, like Rafael Rebelo and now Yamandu and Ginga, of course, and so yeah. I mean, it's just the ability to play all of that stuff. In a solo way, really. And Adam, actually, one of the biggest groups that has been kind of ongoing influence for me was Take Six, the a cappella group. And I just love the way that singers would kind of thread their voices and guitar players. It's hard to do that, right? Like a piano player would, or if you were writing for voices, obviously. So I think there are very few people that are exploring like the contrapuntal nature of the guitar that's possible. Julian certainly is. There are a lot of people that are starting to do that, and even on social media right now on Facebook, you might be hip to that Jimmy Weibel group that Beth Marlis has been. There's so much stuff there to get into. It's amazing.
Yeah. I'm not on Facebook, but one of my guys on this Patreon channel must be going there because he's been sharing some of Jimmy's stuff that I had never heard before, which like him playing through the examples in the classical country book. Not just the etudes, but even just like the here's exercise 26, exercise 27, these little 2-bar, 4-bar things. And that's a real treasure that Beth has. So that's an incredible resource for sure.
Yeah, right. And then with Johnny Smith, I have some of his recordings where he played solo guitar and classical repertoire, all with a pick, which is mind blowing to me. But that's what him and kind of that generation of players, they had set out to play like on the level of Segovia with a pick.
Right.
So, and then there was Stanley Jordan, doing his whole thing. So there's all that to say that have been so many different perspectives and approaches to this that I find fascinating. I love that. There's just a lot of different ways you can do it.
Yeah. So coming back to like the beginner's mind place of it, like if you have a student and maybe they know the harmony, they can play chord scales and block stuff, and you just try to give them like one little seed that could help them to start to hear counterpoint or just imagine what could be possible. Is there a little thing or an exercise or just something that you might share?
Sure. So I guess I would answer that in two ways. One would be a technical way, and then another one would be just as like a simple harmonic thing. But let me just, I guess, make sure that you can see this okay. All right. Whoops. Is that maybe a little bit of a glare? Hang on. Sorry.
That's
all right.
Okay.
Is that a little better? Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
So the very first thing, and you see this in intro, if you're going to play with your fingers, the very first thing is just to actually play chords just with your fingers. Just get used to that sound. So you can feel it. And you want to just strive for like evenness, and so that would be the first thing, is just the feeling of the claw. And then another thing that I do, this is with for more beginner players, would just be little exercises, because a lot of solo guitar playing actually is in the left hand. And this is something that I learned many years ago from Tuck Andrus when I met him and we became friends. And so one thing that, here's just a little exercise that I share with all of my students. If you were to just go 5, 6, 7, 8 across 4 adjacent strings. So I'm starting on the D note A string, right? So 5, 6, 7, 8. And and then you just pluck that with the right hand. A great exercise to start playing solo guitar with counterpoint in multiple parts is just switching fingers. So right now I'm going to switch 1 and 2, first index and middle. Then I'll switch 1 and 3. So now it's a little more difficult because you're skipping the D string, right? So there's a little more of motion there. And then switch 1 and 4, right? 2 and 3, 2 and 4, and then finally 3 and 4. So that's a humbling exercise. But it's really good, I think, just for all guitar players because it gives you some fluidity and finger independence and things like that. But here's like the Karate Kid wax on, wax off magical part of it.
Okay.
When you switch voices, so I'm thinking of these as 4 singers. The switching voices try to make staccato as short as possible. So now you see what's happening is the 2 voices that are switching are absolutely short and staccato. These 2 voices are long tones. So now there's a contrast of articulation. And then you want to develop that with all fingers. And what that will enable you to do is when you play like an actual chord, start to make it more vocal. So if you just have a regular C major 7, for example, I think everybody probably knows that voicing, but it would be like low to high, X, 3, 5, 4, 5 for the frets. Okay, so you can start taking that concept and just having one note ring out while the others are short. So if we do the top voice, you can just let that go. Maybe I'll do the B, which is the middle finger. And the idea is to have that contrast. And then the G note with the 3rd finger. So I'm just kind of training each of those to sustain. And this is hard to do at first, but just by doing this simple exercise, all of a sudden your ears will pay attention to it. So now if you're going to play something like now you can improvise not only with the changes in the bass line, but you can improvise texture. And that's when the magic starts to happen. So some of those are long, some of those are short, and it sounds more like 2 people playing, or at the very least, it's more interesting sounding than if the articulation was the same. So even if we started with this G13, for example, I've got my G, skip the string, and then 3, 4, 5. So now if I'm visualizing these as like 2 different hands on a piano, there's 4 different ways that I could articulate those. Both of those long, both of those short. And all I'm doing, if you even saw the top of my hand, I'm not even coming off the fretboard, I'm just releasing pressure. Right? And notice, by the way, my right hand isn't doing anything different, it's just plucking the strings, that's all. Then we can do a short chord, and now the bass is ringing. Or we can do a short bass. Wow. So now if you just explore those, we've got both short, long bass, long chord. And so the right hand isn't doing anything, but you have 4 very different articulation sounds. So depending on what style you're doing, if you want to do something with like a walking bass style, then you want to train your finger to, kind of be able to stay down while the others are both staying down and releasing. Right. So, and then even if you play like a melody line, you don't want it to be short. Like if the melody's a whole note. Now, a lot of times you can buy some extra time with an open string, but even if it was up here,
wow.
and then
Yeah.
so yeah, that's the idea. There's more of it sounds more like a singer or a horn player playing a melody with a comping guitar player.
Right. If I heard that on a record, I would be easily fooled to thinking that was two people because of the articulation, really, and how you're able to, one line is operating in its own way, and then the accompaniment is operating in its own way. That's incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people first get into this style, they don't think about that stuff because you're so preoccupied with thinking about the right chord and how to do a bass line and all like that. And of course, right, it's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But it's important to at least start thinking about that. Otherwise, you might sound like it's not going to swing. Like obviously, if you went,
Right.
I mean, that's an exaggerated example, but it doesn't swing because the bass feel isn't right. The independence, excuse me, isn't always there, and you don't want to always go on the and of two. So another real quick exercise that I'll start off with in the technical side of things is just do the comp. So it's basically just, this is real entry level. Just take that chord. Now focus on the right hand. So we've got thumb and index, middle, ring. So you can do both together or apart. So you could do a study where if you've got 4 beats in one measure, you could do, you could kind of play the chord on every on beat and off beat. So if we're going to do everything on one, it'd be like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Then maybe do it on 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So that's the motion of doing it all together like the claw. Then when you put it on the and of each beat, now you've got it on the end of 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the end of 2. 1, 2, and 3. On 3. 1, 2, 3. And it's just that same motion, but you're feeling it at different places in the measure, which you're connecting the mind and the ears and the hands.
Amazing.
And then just real quick to do the second part of the question, this might be a couple of lessons in, but within the first 3 or 4 lessons, it's just, I like to start with a less is more approach. So rather than worrying about playing these giant chords, I think guide tones are a great place to start. And then guide tones meaning the 3rd and the 7th, or sometimes the 3rd and 6th of a chord. So so if you have a 2, 5, 1, and C, you've got a D minor 7. You've just got D, F, and C, 1, flat 3, flat 7, to a G7, C major 7. And that's and the way that I have them start, at least, this is just an entry point, is that think about the bass or the roots or both on the bottom 2 strings, the harmony, the guide tones on the middle 2 strings, and then any extensions or solo lines or melody lines on the top 2 strings. Okay. That's a nice way just to start of organizing the fretboard. So we've got with the bass, we've got this 2, 5, 1, or we could do it up here 2, 5, 1. Then you learn to let go of the bass and then maybe sing the note dum. That way you're recognizing these 2 notes as a C major 7. You can kind of hear it.
Yeah.
And then maybe the next step is to just do it without the root and play an extension on there. And just these little things like and then maybe start to move those around a little bit. And that's kind of but it's just the same texture, I guess, is what I'm trying to convey.
Right.
With just, instead of always feeling like you need to play these big block chords, which is fine. That's a tried and true way of playing solo guitar.
Sure.
You can break it up a little bit and have some more textural things. And the way that I was playing there just now, was influenced a lot by Bill Evans, his approach to solo piano, which of course was imparted to Lenny Breau. But the point being is that when you listen to Thelonious Monk play solo piano, it's very much rooted in that Harlem Stride sound, you know?
Right. Right.
And when you listen to Bill Evans alone or alone again, it's very sparse. Like he doesn't even use, the left hand. Like he's not even playing bass lines or walking bass lines or even bass notes. It's all kind of up in this mid area, and it's really refreshing.
Yeah. It hit me just recently. On that Sunday at the Village Vanguard record. Scott LaFaro just sounds so big and bold on the bass. And, some of that comes back to what you're saying before. Some of that's up to the engineer. Some of it's in Scott LaFaro's hands. He maybe just had a giant sound. But also the way that you're describing that Bill Evans played, he wasn't down here a lot on the piano. So that left room for Scott LaFaro to have this big, beautiful sound. Whereas, if he was playing with Monk, say, or somebody else who came out of Stride, then, or like, who do I say, like Errol Garner or somebody like that, you don't necessarily, the bass isn't going to get to speak quite in the same way. But I don't know why it never hit me before recently. Like, part of it is Scott LaFaro, part of it is the engineer, but part of it is like Bill Evans was not in that space. And so it really left a lot of room for this just incredible sound.
Oh, I so agree. When you think of that trio with Paul Motion, it's like this just one mind, that with three people with one mind. And just speaking of Paul Motion, I think that he was so aware of that as a composer, but just the aesthetics of it. I mean, going all the way through into the 90s with the electric bebop groups, with the two guitars and two saxophones, that's a lot of sound. But but it always worked because of the way that people would respond, or the trio recordings with Frizzell, or the beautiful, like that recording, Bill Evans, the name of the record, if you know that, or the On Broadway.
Sure.
All of those, they're just playing so organically and unified. And so I think it's really kind of the same thing, whether you're playing solo guitar or whether you're working with a band. The thing with a band is that it's going to be a lot of chemistry and trust, and maybe talking beforehand about that stuff. Sometimes it just happens naturally. But I think in all of those situations, certainly when a drummer's involved, there needs to be that sensitivity. Like if you're playing like somebody with the dynamic sensibilities of Brian Blade, obviously it's less of an issue than a drummer that's accustomed to playing always at one level. Right. So those are things that you have to think about, I think, when you're playing with a band.
Yeah. And that leads, it's great. It leads me to the last thing really that I wanted to ask you about, which is, over the years, I've heard people say, like, playing solo, whether we're talking about solo piano, solo guitar, but playing as a solo performer, solo artist really makes you well-rounded, because you've got to think orchestrally, and, you're kind of your own Nelson Riddle, or, your own, whomever, you think of, but really like you're doing everything. But on the flip side of it, it doesn't, you can hear if somebody does that all the time that maybe they're not going to be a great ensemble player, because they're just kind of used to like handling everything. And I was really struck on Union Station at how great an ensemble player you are, because I've only ever heard you really in solo context. And I wonder, like, if you have any wisdom about the headspace of like how you take all of the stuff that you can develop as a self-contained musical voice, and then bring that into an ensemble setting. Like, how do you move in those different spaces so fluidly?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I've seen a lot of players, for example, who primarily function as a solo guitar player, not function very well in an ensemble situation. And I think number one, on some level, it's always surrendering the ego, just trying to let, and what I mean by ego, not just like I'm arrogant and this is how, my way or the highway, but also surrender the tendency to be myopic in the musical approach, and just surrender to the music. So when you're surrendering your ego, that means that you're using your instrument and your musical sensibilities in the service of the music. And that can be true even if you're like just dealing from one song to the next. So you're not basically playing the same way over every tune. You know what I mean? I think a lot of people fall into that trap, sometimes unknowingly, not even aware of it. They're like, well, this is my style and this is my lick. And then it doesn't matter whether you're playing a ballad is just slowed down or so it's just sped up. So I think this gets into this is a great point that you bring up. And of course, somebody with your musical sensibilities would think about this deeply. And what it means is, what are your contributions as a musician? And sometimes that means not playing certain things. But it takes I think just a little bit of time thinking about like what the song entails, what the musical experience entails. You're an example of somebody that's played a lot with singers, for example, and I have too. And when you play with singers, you realize, or even, jazz musicians get this bad rap because they don't know how to play in an ensemble, or they don't know how to play in service of the song. And so I think a lot of listening, a lot of study, having an open mind to different approaches. But at the end of the day, if I tried to play like the way I play solo with an organ trio, it just wouldn't work. And so that means taking advantages of different registers of the guitar. So for example, one of the registers of the guitar that I really love is like down here, maybe, and it's harder to do that when you're competing with sonic space with the bass player, you just have to let some of that stuff go. So, I think what you mentioned gets into that age-old, how do guitar players and piano players comp together? Well, it's easy actually if you just listen, and think about like letting go and how to deal with that. But the way that Wes Montgomery and Wynton Kelly played together, and Kenny Burrell and Tommy Flanagan. There's so many examples. Organ trio is a great way where you can comp with an organ, I feel, because the sound of the instruments is so differently. So different.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
And even if you're talking about somebody like, Dave Matthews, the textures of electric guitar with effects on it contrast an acoustic guitar, and that also works well. So it's being compatible not only with the style, but the song and all of the other musicians that you're playing with, and just finding that space where you can exist that's always in service of the song.
Wow. That's beautiful. Really generous answer. Well, man, Sean, thank you for spending this time with us, and I really appreciate your insight. And it's great that we got to hear you play a little bit too. You mentioned, I think, before we started recording that you should be coming to New York for this Frank Vignola festival. So I hope that happens sooner than later, because I'd love to give you a hug, and I'd love to get to hear you play guitar.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. That's a perfect example. I mean, talk about playing with 3 guitar players. But if you play with your ears and your heart, I think it can always work. But I just want to mention that if anybody is interested, you can visit my website. It's SeanMcGowanGuitar.com, and that will, I have got some, hopefully, if the numbers go accordingly, I've got some gigs coming up this spring, which I'm very excited about, like playing with Frank Vignola and Jimmy Bruno, but I've also got some shows with Pierre Bensusson and Tony McManus later this summer, which is really fun because it's an opportunity to explore some of those more acoustic sides of things, which I enjoy so much.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's where I'm gonna be going to your website as soon as we're done talking, because I want to catch those shows. That's great. Thank you for that.
And thank you for having me. It's always so nice to talk with you and to see you. So thanks for having me on, man.
Of course, brother. All right. Take good care.
All right. See you later.